Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Teresa Thompson, Greco Stakeholder Engagement Manager, and thank you for joining today for Consumer Consent Solution Design Consultation webinar. So if we look at the aims and objectives of today, if you can move on for me, please, Jenny. So today's session is an opportunity to walk you through the key themes and outcomes from the consultation, explain how stakeholder feedback is shaping the ongoing CCS design, and outline the next steps as we move forward towards the rec drafting and the summer consultation phase. So we'll be focusing on the most prominent themes raised by stakeholders during that consultation and highlighting both areas of broad support and where respondents challenged aspects of the proposed approach or requested further development. So this session is also about transparency and continued engagement, and we want stakeholders to understand not only what we've heard, but how that feedback is influencing the current design and priorities and the future decision making. So by the end of today's webinar, we hope you'll have a clearer understanding of the key consultation themes, how the design is evolving, where further work and engagement are still underway, and how you can continue contributing as the programme progresses. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping points. So if you could move on for me, please, Jenny. Could I kindly ask that everyone keeps their cameras and microphones switched off during the speaker sessions to minimise the background noise and help the webinar run smoothly? We encourage everyone to submit questions throughout the session, and you can use the Slido function, which you'll see in the Teams, and add the reference number, or you can click on the QR code that's on the screen here now. We do have the project leads and the subject matter experts joining us today, and we'll aim to answer as many of those questions as possible during the session. We have a lot to get through in this session, so if time allows, we'll also open the floor for a live Q&A at the end. And any questions that we don't get to cover today, we will still be reviewed and addressed in our post-webinar follow-up communications. As a reminder, please keep questions relevant to today's session and avoid referencing other organisations where possible. And finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and both the recording and the presentation slides will be shared afterwards through our usual comms channels. So before we move into the detail, I'll briefly take you through today's agenda. So we'll begin with a consultation at a glance overview. That'll be covering the scale of the engagement, the headline themes raised by stakeholders, and the overall response to the consultation. We'll then spend most of the session focusing on exploring the key themes in more detail, where feedback is influencing design decisions and the CCS programme's immediate priorities moving forward. After that, we'll move into the Q&A, as mentioned earlier, and we'll answer as many of those questions as possible during the session, with any outstanding questions addressed afterwards. And finally, we'll close with the next steps, and that's including up-and-coming engagement opportunities, the rec drafting activity, and how stakeholders can continue contributing as the programme develops. So, turning now to the consultation at a glance. So firstly, I'd like to thank everyone who responded to the CCS design consultation. We really do appreciate the time, the expertise and the thoughtful feedback provided throughout the process. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Jenny. So the consultation was launched the 11th of February and closed on the 25th of March this year. And during that time, we received 31 formal responses across the 32 consultation questions, and that generated more than 645 individual comments and identifying 10 overarching themes. So overall, stakeholders broadly welcome the ambition behind CCS, particularly the goal of giving consumers clearer control over access to the energy data through a secure and standardised framework. At the same time, respondents raised important challenges about several aspects of the proposed design. And these included key points such as the MMP scope, the legality, items around ID&V, implementation burden, and the consumer inclusion. Importantly, this feedback has been constructive and extremely valuable. It's directly informed the next phase of the design work and helped identify where the further evidence, engagement, and refinements are needed. So today's session is intended as an interim response to that feedback, and the final design positions alongside the more detailed REC drafting proposals will be consulted on further during the summer REC drafting consultation. So if we move on, so what emerged from the consultation was a very balanced picture of both support and challenge. On the support side, there was broad agreement with the overall ambition behind the CCS. Stakeholders welcomed the move towards clearer consumer control over consented access to energy data, alongside the development, as we've mentioned, of the secure and standardised consent framework. There was also strong support for the phased minimal marketable product approach, as well as the use of open standards, including FAPI 2.0, and that's to support the interoperability and the future scalability. At the same time, respondents were clear that the implementation must remain proportionate, practical, and aligned with the existing industry arrangements. The most consistent areas of challenge focused on were the legal operational authority for consent, alignment with the existing SEC arrangements and the risk of duplication, the proportionality of the identity and the verification requirements, inclusion and accessibility considerations that we needed to look at, and the balance between the cost, delivery burden, and demonstrating consumer benefit. What's particularly encouraging is that that feedback wasn't simply criticism of the programme or its ambition. In many cases, we saw that stakeholders supported the direction of travel while challenging us to ensure that that solution is practical, proportionate, and deliverable in the real world. Those conversations that we've had have been really, really incredibly valuable, and they've helped us better understand where stakeholders see the potential risks, where greater clarity is needed, and where the further evidence or engagement will strengthen the design. As a result, the consultation has directly shaped the phase of the work and informed the priority areas, and they're now being taken forward as the design continues to evolve. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Matt White, who's the product owner and the SRO for CCS, and he's going to take you through the key themes in more detail. So Matt, can I hand over to you?
Thanks, Teresa. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. So we'll go through the key themes one by one, and I'll go through essentially what the feedback is that we've heard, and our kind of latest SIP rep on where we are with each theme, and a bit of signalling as to what comes next. So if we can jump on to the first slide, please. The first one is around MMP scope. So this was the first question in the consultation question set. And we got some really good feedback through this as a bit of an opening to the consultation responses that we received, with loads of really good detail from respondents. So just to echo Teresa's thanks for the level of kind of detail and feedback and expertise that we've had through the consultation responses is certainly welcome. So essentially, the responses around the minimal marketable product scope and roadmap were supportive of the CCS ambition, as Teresa said, with some counsel on whether we are being too narrow in relation to what we are defining as our minimum marketable product, specifically around what consumers are expected to want to see in relation to what that centralised record looks like and the information that it contains. in addition to that, so that's around the kind of full visibility and getting to that one truth view as quickly as possible, and whether there is elements of data that's available today that would support that ambition in relation to delivery at the MMP timescale. Some additional feedback around the inclusion and of the energy data holders that we were specifying in the consultation. I will clarify here that you will hear us start to use the term energy data holders from this point onwards. In the consultation, that was defined as energy data providers. However, they are one in the same thing. We're just aligning the terminology with other schemes that are happening at the moment. So energy data holders is the term that we'll use now. So the inclusion of smart DCC, the Alexa and SDR, the DCC SMEDA, and also the secular users as well. So mixed views in relation to the target for MMP on the inclusion of those, although obviously broad support that energy data holders are required for the implementation of CCS. So that essentially summarises the feedback that we had, where we are at the moment and where our focus is maintaining the phased delivery approach that we articulated in the consultation, with a nuance there that we are doing additional work at the moment to look into where we might have some essentially quick wins to bring in additional data that supports the consumer view for MMP, minimal marketable products, in Q1 next year. So we are investigating that much more actively to see what we can bring in to that, and we will continue to communicate that as we learn more. Our key consideration there is around, if the data is available, can it be translated into a consumer meaningful view that doesn't confuse or create ambiguity for the consumer in understanding what that data is, in essence. So making sure that that is really clear to consumers is essentially the focus of that work. So data being available is one thing, being able to make sure that consumers understand what it means to them is very important for making sure that it does become a quick win. And if there is elements that can be brought into MMP, then that is going to be the key tests that we will apply to that data. So phase delivery is certainly very important to that. And that will obviously be an element in relation to the one truth view of consumer consent as an overarching goal that will help us obviously get to that view potentially a little bit quicker, or along that train a little bit quicker. Around hybrid implementation, there was obviously feedback provided around what hybrid means, and the interpretation was different essentially from the Ofgem decision. But I guess the key things there around what hybrid means to us, around what becomes central and what is decentralized, is ID and consent is centralized within our proposal for CCS. Specifically in relation to the signal around building of a trust framework and the consumer identity being known to a centralized entity to reduce that fragmentation for the consumer is really important. I'll touch on that a little bit more when we get to the ID section of today. But delivering that centralized element around ID and consumer record for consent is an important element to generating that trust framework that can support the CCS being a centralized view for consumers and get into that one truth view for the consumer. Then decentralization is with the data sharing itself. So the data is being shared or will be shared between parties from different energy data holders that will be able to record with it through the directory and registry of the solution what their data endpoints are and what essentially their data products are, that allows people to consume those through the CCS solution once they're onboarded, whether that be through individual access or bilateral agreements being placed, or whether that being kind of open source for any authorized third party to use, will be something that we'll start to address in the design as well. So just a bit of a summary there in relation to what our current focus is around continuing with our phased delivery, maintaining the kind of centralized and decentralized lookers to consent, and data sharing being central versus decentral. We'll look into engagement with further energy data holders around participation, as further clarity becomes available with other initiatives that are happening around data sharing ecosystems and repositories, and we'll communicate that through our engagement. So we're balancing our ambition based on the delivery reality and making sure that the solution becomes operable and serviceable when it goes live. So that is a bit of a whistle stop on MMP scope. If we can jump on to the next section, which is consumer or occupier versus customer or bill payer. So this is one of the next, or this is the next theme. So thinking about the feedback that we received firstly, so what you all told us around and essentially general agreement that the occupier is the data subject as far as GDPR is concerned, and making sure that we understand the nuance of what that means for CCS and the GB energy market in general. And I guess counsel on that essentially a lot of systems and processes that operate today do focus potentially mostly on account holders or bill payers. There's concerns around how that works with other consent models that are around and operating already today. And again, some additional clarity needed and questions around how the multiple occupancy scenarios are going to work in practice. So that's a bit of a summary about the feedback that's been given, and then moving on to essentially where we are and where our focus is. So at the moment, we are going through a process of legal review. So that is going over the legal advice that we've already had and iterating that legal advice in relation to new information, the consultation feedback and statements that have been made by others, and evolving that legal feedback and legal review into the appropriate scenario where we are today. We have also and are also actively engaging with the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, in relation to the proposal of CCS, utilising the feedback that we've had through the consultation and other conversations to make sure we get a really true rounded view through the ICO conversations and feedback that we will obtain from them to again make sure that we are really focused on what is CCS really truly looking to do in relation to this question about occupier versus bill payer, and making sure that we're driving the right outcome for what the consumer needs in relation to the protections that they need in relation to initiatives such as CCS. Wider alignment is also happening with SECO. So we're in bilateral and wider conversations with SECO on how we develop these positions, and ultimately how that will work, and how REC and SEC essentially work alongside each other as CCS comes into play. So those engagements and conversations are ongoing, with more communications to come to industry as those mature. And of course, Ofgem and DESNES are involved in that, and we will also be utilising the ICO feedback that we will receive through those conversations as well to support with alignment as we go forward. Ultimately, the position on owner occupier will be summarised and benchmarked in the summer design consultation, the drafting consultation. Sorry. So it's important to say that that's the kind of formal point where we will formalise the direction that CCS is proposing to go into on this question. But we will also be utilising the consumer consent solution groups to discuss this in more detail as we develop those positions as well. So more information will be shared through those forums. So a bit of a summary then is we're working through the position and bringing in the right advice to steer us in relation to what the right outcome for this question will be around who the appropriate data subject is for giving consent to access to energy personal data. And we will be transparent with all organisations that we're working with on that direction and align as appropriate. So that's a summary for occupier versus build payer. If we move on to the next slide, please. Very similar in relation to theme, but this is kind of diving down into the alignment with SEC. So this smart energy code and specifically SECO, obviously, who look after that, similar to RECO, looking after the REC. So our engagement and alignment with SECO, what we've heard through the consultation was around concerns that we'll see some duplication or parallel kind of assurance and access mechanisms that will increase burden on organisations participating in CCS with things that are already being assured or governed under the SEC. Some risks around increasing the burden on organisations and costs on organisations as a result of that. Questions and concerns around how, in practice, the existing consent mechanisms of the SEC work alongside CCS and how they transition to CCS as well in the longer term. So some concerns shared around how that will work and what our answers will be in relation to that transition. Longer term, looking for more clarity on the CCS and the SEC relationship, and making sure the assurance boundaries are very clear as to where the assurance boundaries sit between the two codes. So I guess summary feedback is a council on having a very strong focus on duplication, making sure parallel models risks are managed, and understanding long-term clarity as to our direction of travel over the more longer term. So our focus at the moment is defining what the REC and SEC boundaries look like and working with SEC directly on those boundaries, ultimately to avoid duplication at all possible points, and align assurance processes to make sure that they are aligned according to appropriate accountabilities between the retail energy code and the smart energy code. Coordinate our efforts on assurance and making sure that they are complementary and not duplicative wherever possible. And that work is continuing at the moment with SECO, and more information will be coming on that as that work matures, with us having had an additional our first face-to-face a few weeks ago, working through some of the complexities and detail on that. So more work to do on this one to support us in relation to the direction that we go in, and to give all industry participants reassurance that we will do the work and we will come back to you with the detail and making sure that we're clearly articulating how that's going to work. REC drafting consultation, as Teresa mentioned and I've already mentioned today, will be the formal point where that will be underlined, but we will be using the CCS solution groups in the interim to report back on how that work is going and what outcomes are coming through. So again, a clear objective there around avoiding all unnecessary burdens on organisations and making sure that we can articulate a clear and safe transition to the future that CCS brings to the sector. So moving on to the next slide, please. So identity verification, one of the key elements around feedback in the consultation on this one. So just to summarise that, firstly, the feedback was split. There was strong feedback from certain parties in relation to making sure that we have strong IDV to make sure the consumer protection is at the heart of what CCS is looking to bring, but including with that strong view, we also had the risks raised around the friction that that strong IDV creates, that could obviously have a negative impact on CCS in relation to consumer adoption and drop off. So a balance is needed to be struck in relation to IDV to make sure that we've got the right solution that gives the consumers the protection that they need around access to data, while also making sure that that barrier is not too high that prevents consumers utilising the solution. Also concerns and counsel provided around the inclusivity of ID&V and making sure that we've got the right approach to journeys where people might not necessarily have ID, or they might have low digital confidence, to support them utilising what typically are digital journeys around identity verification. And making sure that we can address any repeating ID&V elements to again drive simplicity and adoption. So where our focus is at the moment is that we're going through active assessment on the proportionality of IDV and the solutions that are available to us to bring into minimal marketable product MMP next year. So we are actively investigating what the appropriateness of our ID&V needs to be to address the guidance that we have, obviously the general guidance from government in relation to ID&V and best practice, and obviously overlaying that onto the practical implications of CCS and the risks and sensitivity of the data that we're talking about. Obviously, predominantly we're focusing on metering data, so whether that be import or export, that use case in relation to the half hourly and the sensitivity of that, and making sure that we're having active assessment on exactly what IDV really means in practice against that particular set of data and the use cases that we're referring to. In relation to inclusion, inclusion is an element that we have stated and we're minded to keep in relation to how inclusion is addressed over time. We'll be looking to make sure that the CCS is as inclusive as possible in relation to MMP, but coming back to the MMP scope point before, we are taking an iterative approach. So the inclusion of things like delegated authority and other journeys that supports access through CCS to sections of society and pockets of people that require additional support will be addressed and brought in over time, while again focusing to make sure that MMP can be as inclusive as possible with the solutions that we can. We're not just essentially going to push inclusion down the road. There's something that we can do as one of those quick wins to include more people from MMP, then we will absolutely bring that in. That's part of our scoping conversations as well in relation to our IDV. And one thing I mentioned earlier about IDV and the centralization of IDV into CCS is one of the benefits that brings is that once the CCS has been through, or a consumer has been through a CCS journey for the first time, then CCS will know that consumer and they will have completed the IDV for the consumer, which means that irrespective of the ATP that they go to in future, once the ATP is working on top of CCS, then they will not need to repeat their ID&V step. They will just need to essentially authenticate themselves that they are an existing known entity to CCS through simple logins or passkey enablement, and then therefore that they can give consent without having to go through any form of IDV friction again in future for giving consent to new services solutions that require access to their data. So that's one of the really key benefits that we want to call out with CCS and the centralization of IDV and the consent record, is that it gives us the opportunity to do that. That simplifies the consumer's participation in future services and solutions and initiatives in GB Energy. So that's our focus and summary. So making sure we can get consumers to verify once, and we're targeting what the balance of our approach to IDV looks like. And we'll communicate this in more detail as the detail becomes available to be published as we're completing some of the work that we're doing to investigate that. Cool. Next slide, please. Thank you. So zero trust and consent check-in. So feedback on this one through the consultation was concerns around the performance and scalability of our proposals that were generating our kind of benchmarks around generating a zero trust trust framework infrastructure. So that was some of the concerns and questions on the per transaction validation, so known as introspection, and how that would work in relation to bulk or scheduled use cases where data access is being scheduled, and also some questions around how caching and outage caching of consent tokens would be used, and whether webhooks could be a suitable replacement. And also issues around how outage handling would be handled, and specific questions, as we didn't articulate what and a long outage would be classified as two questions as to what we would put in relation to the specific timing of what a long duration outage would be classified as. So our focus here really at the moment is focusing on, we are minded to maintain the introspection model. The reasons for that is in relation to the security and trust structure that we're establishing. We've had multiple bilateral conversations since the consultation has come through to dig into the concerns that were there. But ultimately, what we're talking about in relation to the introspection is a super lightweight API validation based on, again, open standards, so OAuth. And it is not repeating the kind of the wider consent journey in relation to the introspection. It is super lightweight, and it is part of the security posture that we are establishing around how the data is best handled, and making sure that that introspection is at point of event of data sharing is critical in relation to the way that trust framework infrastructure works, and it's kind of foundational to the approach that we're taking. So we are continuing to discuss that with certain energy data holders where questions are arising, but that is our minded to position as we stand today, to maintain that. Around the batching and scheduling of consents, again, that is an area where we're discussing bilaterally with organisations where that's sensitive, and we're discussing how that can work in relation to the introspection and supporting organisations as to how that would work best in practice. So those discussions are ongoing in relation to some of the practical implications. That will be supported now. We have onboarded our technical partner, who is Radium, and now they're on board and we're getting into the specifics and the definitions of exactly what these will look like. Then that will support those conversations, and I guess we're hoping that will await some of the concerns there, that this is a particularly kind of heavyweight or difficult thing to implement against the existing systems that are in place. Where we talk about webhooks and consent caching, this we see as in support and support only in relation to the operability of CCS. It's the introspection step that is still the valid point in relation to check before data is being shared. But obviously we do see the need for webhooks where CCS can update where a consent record may have been revoked, as an example. So people are aware, but irrespective of the webhooks existing, the introspection step is still going to be important. And we are putting a time frame of 12 hours as our assumption for outages, where data sharing data sharing can continue, but we are consulting with the ICO and others in government in relation to that particular assumption to see whether that is appropriate. And obviously we're certainly keen to hear feedback from industry stakeholders on that too. Now we have put an assumed time frame on the maximum outage as per requested through the consultation feedback. Our focus really, to sum that up, is making sure that the trust signal is high, and the introspection is well understood by industry through further conversations through solution groups and bilaterals, and making sure that that assumption around 12 hours is further validated to move from assumption into decisions made. So that's the zero trust. So if we move on to the next one, we're moving on to MTLS and security. So use of MTLS and open standards and the security posture of CCS was things that we included in the consultation, previous consultation, at a high level to show direction, but also to specify what the certain open standards were that we were looking to utilise. So we had strong support around our approach to open standards, not least because that simplifies things for industry, and it uses well-tested and threat-modelled solutions that we can evidence based on how they are implemented and investigated and designed by others. And therefore, obviously, that simplifies and reduces the costs for RECO and CCS in the industry. So that's certainly a significant benefit, which was the underpinning of the strong support for open standards, and specifically MTLS for the CCS interactions and FAPI2 as well. Obviously, other open standards that we discuss here is around OIDC and others as well. So strong support for our approach there, with a slight counsel that the scope of defining MTLS as being required for the data sharing between ATPs and EDHs, so authorised third parties and energy data holders, was an area where people question whether that is truly part of the scope of what CCS is looking to do, or being brought in to do, and some concerns around how that works with existing DCC arrangements. That's a summary of the feedback so far. So where our focus is at the moment is we're looking to keep MTLS as the baseline in relation to the security posture of the solution, and how those ultimately the trust framework operates. It's certainly very important to us, and as part of the design, and therefore also what the trust signals are, and the trust element is in practice once the solution is live, to make sure that when an entity is requesting data, that it can be highly relied upon that that entity is the original person or organisation that the consent token was provided to, and that's why MTLS through the data sharing layer is important, to make sure that there is mutual validation that the two parties are the right parties to be exchanging the data based on the consent that had been generated through the consumer consent solution. So we are minded to keep that as the baseline, and what that means for us is essentially that we are aligning with DCC, NESO and Alexon, and also involved in our conversations with SECO around that being the appropriate standard to use specifically for the new initiatives. So DSI is an example with NESO, and the SDR and Alexon. We've communicated previously that there is already alignment with the fact that MTLS and API data sharing will be a shared standard, which again helps in relation to interoperability. So organisations are using similar standards for similar initiatives in GB Energy that hopefully helps support this. But what we'll also be doing is making sure that we're looking at how we can support implementation. So where these may be new initiatives or new standards that people are unfamiliar with, that we can make sure that we've got the right tooling and support and guidance available to make sure that this becomes as easy as possible for organisations to align to and to ultimately implement. So keeping MTLS as a baseline, aligning cross-sector in relation to the other initiatives that are happening, and supporting with this, implementation is essentially the key drivers of our focus at the moment. And again, as I've mentioned before, as those technical specifications are being drawn up and will become public, then hopefully that will reassure organisations that we are not talking about really heavy stuff here. We are talking about stuff that is well understood, publicly available, open standards, etc., that should reduce the burden on organisations having to do excessive work to implement things. So just conscious of time, so I will speed up a little bit. But if we go on to the next slide, please, on customer experience. So main feedback here is around needing to articulate clear purpose and benefit of the customer experience guideline approach that we're taking, and making sure that we are addressing friction and how that governance is going to work in relation to the implementation of CCS, and supporting organisations through the implementation, specifically within the ATP journeys. And making sure that we do drive the consistency in the consent journey, how it's implemented, to make sure that consumers can see that as a recognisable journey more and more over time. So that's a summary of the feedback. And our focus really at the moment in relation to customer experience is firstly user research. We are in wave 2 now of our user research, with wave 1 having been reported through the solution groups a few weeks ago. So we are really looking to be steered by our consumer research. That is both the research that we are conducting ourselves, but also through the research that has happened through others, specifically citizens advice and money and mental health. And also Which as well. So we're looking at what research is available to us that's publicly available through other organisations, as well as doing our own research to again bring in more specificity with energy, GB energy, and the context of CCS. So consumer testing is key and important to informing how we go and what we do in relation to the user experience of CCS. We're also commissioned, since the consultation, some work around a trust mark. So that's a very glitzy term of saying, what do consumers call CCS? If they were to know what it was, what should it be called? So that's not kind of a massive brand activity. That is an identity and a trust signal that we can utilise with consumers. And that work has been commissioned and is in progress at the moment to understand, well, what will work as a conventional name for CCS outside of what we call it, obviously, in these conversations and through the project delivery. And ultimately, the CEGs, the customer experience guidelines, making sure that they are standardized, there to standardize the experience of CCS as it appears, while not infringing on the ATP's wider branding and customer strategy. The important thing here is, and the one thing to emphasise, is the customer experience guidelines is looking to make sure that the CCS journey itself is uniform and recognisable, and it is not looking to infringe outside of that goal. There may be supporting information that we can provide to ATPs that help them in relation to their journeys, but that will be obviously optional consumable information that will be platformed in non kind of committal documentation, so support materials or lower category information through the rec that will support with implementation and context setting, but we are being very specific in the customer experience guidelines to make sure that they are very focused on the areas that need to be uniform and not infringing outside of that. So just to give a bit of reassurance and confidence on our approach there. Okay, next slide then, please. I've touched on inclusion and accessibility a little bit in the MMP scope. Concerns that were raised more specifically around CCS is digitally first, which we recognise and is the case. and the need for making sure that we are having focus on what non-digital journeys are appropriate to be looking at, and how assistance is provided to consumers that have exist or additional needs for any form of inclusion needs. So our focus here is, again, utilising the research so we are taking an approach where we are actively recruiting people from a wide variety of different backgrounds with different experiences and different understandings and capabilities. So that is part of our research approach. And as I mentioned before in the MMP, in relation to our focused on iterative design, is that we will look to continue to iterate CCS over time to bring in additional accessibility journeys or supportive journeys, or where appropriate, which probably will and could look like we are and working with additional organisations that might be best placed to support those journeys where they already have existing solutions and capabilities in doing so. So this is going to be something that will need to evolve over time. But as I kind of mentioned at the top under the MMP scope section, is that we'll be looking to make sure the digital journey is as inclusive as possible. And our focus there is WCAG 2.2 AA standards and driving to that for the CCS from MMP, and looking for our compliance with those standards from MMP as well. So at least from a digital perspective, those channels are highly accessible from MMP. Okay, next slide then, please. Governance and assurance. Really good support here for the REC governance model, with some questions needed around ATP and EDH involvement. Reference in this section around making sure that the customer experience guidelines are not too prescriptive. So I've addressed that one, so I'll not talk about that one too much more here. And needing some clear redress routes. So our work at the moment is focusing on building on existing REC governance, so not looking to reinvent the wheel, but utilise what we have already under the REC, and tweak and enhance that in order to bring CCS in. We're looking to enable further engagement with ATPs and EDHs on what those routes look like through the solution groups and also bilateral conversations. Making sure that the CGs are flexible to be specific to what is needed versus what is supportive. And we're also doing work on complaint handling at the moment and what that needs to look like, engaging with Ofgem and DESNES, and also looking at ombudsman type solutions to understand what that would need to look like for CCS, to make sure that the right complaint processes are in place and the right support mechanisms for consumers are addressed through the CCS, and that the consumers have the right mechanisms to seek redress as appropriate. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour on governance, but moving on to the next slide, please. Okay, funding. So mixed views in the consultation on funding versus kind of a support for the funding model that we have proposed, and some additional questions around duplication with SEC came up under funding, around more on costs in relation to how organisations participate and where they are incurring costs already. And also impact on consumers, and making sure that we're really clear that the benefit is there for consumers, and ultimately the beginning approach for funding around that being through the RECO typical funding and model through suppliers. So our work on this at the moment is making sure that we can support the early adoption of CCS, and make sure that we can get the uptake and the solution delivered for the beginning of the MMP and for the period just beyond that. So making sure that we've got the right approach to bringing that to market is really key. The Ofgem impact assessment included a range of different proposals and one of those and those ranges included high cost and low uptake scenarios, which prove that CCS still provides benefit even in those, and making sure that essentially we stick within the parameters of what have already been consulted on is really key. There has been statements recently mentioned that there's a perception that CCS is going to be a significant cost. I won't mention the number that's been quoted, but I was very, very surprised at the point that it had been mentioned. So just to really clearly call out there, if you're hearing any astronomical numbers in relation to CCS costs, they are highly likely to be rumour and not accurate. RECO does obviously publish its business case and its forward work plan in relation to how it's funded. So if you do have any questions around kind of costs, then I would certainly encourage you to look at the published record from CCS firstly, and obviously do come to us if you've got any further follow-up questions. But please do not participate in the rumour mill, because it is highly inaccurate, and I mean highly inaccurate, and not true. So we'll continue to collaborate with Ofgem, NISO, Elexon, DESNZ and SECO in relation to how the wider initiatives are working, and to make sure that we are working with the right collaborative, doing the right collaboration, and to make sure that we are not kind of stepping on each other's toes in relation to the different initiatives that are working, and those are nicely aligned to make sure that the right charges are going through the right mechanisms to support with the ongoing work that's happening around the sector. And we'll continue to be transparent through the RECO mechanisms of the publications that we do, and obviously working with Ofgem and the publications that they do around the cost benefit analysis of CCS and how that evolves over time as we move forward. So just to come to the last slide of summary then for me, and you'll be glad that this finishes my speaking for this afternoon. I'll hand back over to Teresa just to close us out. But a bit of a summary there, that we're looking at consent authority, specifically around legal ICO engagement and supplier evidence. So that is one of the things that Ofgem's doing at the moment around gathering information from suppliers and their approaches to that as well. We are actively engaging with SECO to align REC and SEC boundaries, look at the assurance frameworks to make sure that they're complementary, and define what the transition plan looks like to move into CCS. IDV proportionality, making sure that that's appropriate to what we need for CCS for MMP, and also to make sure that we're testing the friction of what that brings to make sure it's the proportional level to the absolute need to make sure that we're providing the protection that's needed for access to the data. The technical guidance will start to iterate quite quickly now that Radium is on board as the technology provider for the CCS Trust framework. So you will see more information on that through solutions groups, and we'll continue to iterate on our customer experience guidelines. We'll give more clarity on the trust mark work as that concludes, and we'll continue to update on messaging for consumers and how we are using research to influence how we communicate the CCS journey and how we define what that needs to look like on top of the technology. And we're focusing on making sure that we are keeping costs to a minimum. We're procuring open off-the-box technology, which significantly reduces the need to do massive bespoke build for this. So we're reutilising, and that's the benefit that Radium brings about an existing trust framework that's out there that means that we can deploy faster and at lower cost. And we'll continue to phase the iterations of MMP and beyond to make sure that we are delivering the things that are needed for the industry and consumers. So that is me done for today. So Teresa, just hand back to you to close us out.
Great, thanks, Matt. Very, very conscious of time. We have had a couple of questions in Slido. I think we've got one that's just still opening, although I think our colleagues are looking to sort of answer that directly. I suppose we can open it up for a few minutes if anyone has got any other questions before we do the close out. If not, obviously you can pop the questions to us. I don't know if we can just keep the Slido open post the event, Jenny, or we can just make sure that people can contact us through the Box account for that process. I think we've got just one open one at the moment. You can see. Yeah, so yes, we will be sharing the slides. We've had a couple of questions on that. It will be going onto our Reco website along with the recording, and any of the Q&As that have been submitted, we'll put those responses accordingly with that and include it to our frequently asked questions. Yep, so we've got a question from Rachel. Can suppliers still provide data direct to either consumer or ATP, or would they be required to go through the CCS? So is there anything on there that we can respond to on Rachel on that from one of the team?
I don't mind taking that one.
Thanks,
Rachel, it'd be interesting to understand any particular use cases that you're thinking of there. But ultimately, if consent is required for access to the data, then the expectation would be that would need to be a data sharing arrangement that would be set up on top of CCS, and CCS would be used for gathering and managing the consent for that data sharing arrangement once obviously CCS is implemented and over time. So it's a bit of a broad statement that I've made there, Rachel, but happy to chat to you individually about any use cases that you've got in mind to make sure that we're considering the right things. But yeah, if it's based on consent, then the assumption I would say as an answer to that question would be that it would come through CCS. I can take Simon's question as well if you want, Teresa.
Yeah, we have responded to it. I don't know if that's okay, Simon, or is there any other questions that you'd like? Oh, yeah, I think we've just got another one in from Simon. So how will the IDMV work when most domestic customers don't even know what an MPXN is, and then no doubt they need to provide it to link to the data?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's laid out probably in more detail in the design consultation rather than today, Simon. But ultimately, the CCS will link the consumer based on the information that they provide and through their IDV to their MPXN. So once they've been through IDV and they've identified who they are and where they live, then where they live will then be matched through the inquiry services to their MPXN. So again, that's this consumer specific journey or the domestic specific journey. And just to come back, if I think it might have been replied to already, I'm not looking at the slide at the moment, but in relation to non-domestic, we will look to do specific non-domestic communications and engagement with industry when we are starting to look at the scope of what CCS could do in the non-domestic setting. So when we do get around to that in the future roadmap of CCS, looking for non-domestic inclusion, then at the start of that journey, we will be linking out and doing specific engagement on that topic. And obviously that may change in relation to what I've just said there about the approach to domestic. Don't know, we need to do that scoping exercise with parties in industry. So I think we've timed out there, Teresa. So
we have, unfortunately, but we will be looking at responding to these and publishing them. So any questions that have been put through, we will be responding to them in more detail as well. So apologies for that. We really have maxed out. I don't know if we've got time to quickly run through the next steps, Jenny, before close out, so people know. Okay, so as you know, we've got the webinar today. And we will be looking to publish the design consultation response document either this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest. So please look out for that. That will be on our website. And we'll follow up with the post-com slides, recordings, etc. Of the webinar today. From June onwards, the team will be looking at the lower level design and looking at the rec drafting legal text of what that will be in preparation for the midsummer in August, where we're looking to publish the rec drafting consultation for a 6-week period, and also looking to actually host another rec engagement day So we might feed out to you on what you might find more useful, whether you want something that's a face-to-face or similar to what we've done now as a webinar, with a later engagement day when we're looking at the implementation. So which nicely moves on to the September-October time, where we'll have the final positions from the REC drafting consultation and the implementation planning will commence. But however, all through this, we are looking to engage with everyone. We're quite keen to continue the bilateral discussions. And if there's any areas you'd like us to come and talk to, please get in contact with us. If you could move really to the last slide for me, please. So yeah, so we're still saying, you know, if you want to join our consumer consent working groups, please do so. You can register on the link here. This will be a usable link when we publish. We also have a CCS newsletter as well to keep updated on what's happening with the programme. And also, if you have any queries at all, or you want to get in contact with us to explore anything more about or talk about any aspect of the programme, just reach out to us on the consumerconsent@retailenergy.co.uk. And lastly, we are still quite eager to talk to any ATPs or anyone that's looking to be an early adopter for the MMP. We've put a QR code here as well. So if there are any interested parties that wish to discuss that or show an interest more, again, please click on the link and that will leave you details and we can arrange a contact session with you. So like I said, we will be publishing all of the questions that have been submitted. Sincere apologies, we haven't managed to cover them all, but we're really grateful and thank you for joining us today. So if there's nothing further, I'd like to draw it to a close.